assessing spontaneous breathing, and my talk would be mainly focused on monitoring. And first of all, why it is important to monitor spontaneous respiratory activity, particularly in ARDS patients. Well, this is a slide from the LungSafe study. LungSafe study collected thousands of ARDS patients and over 5 continents, 500 ICUs. And some of these ARDS patients were ventilated during the first days by non-invasive ventilation, pressure support non-invasive ventilation. And what happened? When we compared the survival of invasive ventilation, patients treated with invasive ventilation, with patients treated with non-invasive ventilation, the survival of patients treated with non-invasive ventilation was worse, 15% less survival. One of the reasons of that is probably on the respiratory drive of the ARDS patients. Here, I have difficulties with the laser. You see the relationship between PCO2 and mild, moderate, and severe patients. The severe ARDS patients had higher PCO2. These are controlled mechanical ventilation. Why? How comes that more severe patients have higher PCO2? Because the physician tries to limit ventilation and ventilator-induced lung injury in the most severe patients, and PCO2 goes up. At the opposite, when patients were in spontaneous pressure support, non-invasive ventilation, the more severe the patient, the lower the PCO2. Because the more severe patients wanted to breathe more. Their drive was higher. And that is the opposite of what we expect. So sometimes maintaining spontaneous activity might be dangerous. Delaying intubation might be dangerous. This is another example. Non-invasive ventilation in hypoxemic patients. And this is a paper by Carteau from Paris. And those patients that had higher tidal volume had higher failure rate. The sicker the patient, the higher the tidal volume, once again. We are used to think about ventilator-induced lung injury and connect mechanical ventilation to ventilator-induced lung injury. This is part of the truth. Actually, we should not be talking about ventilator-induced lung injury, but rather about ventilation-induced lung injury. Ventilation-induced lung injury might be generated also by spontaneous breathing. In this experiment in the lab of Ted Kolobov in the 1980 late 80s. They induced hyperventilation by injecting an acid into the cisterna magna of the ship. And the ship that was hyperventilating got ARDS. Exactly when we hyperventilate with a mechanical ventilator. The problem is not who generates the pressure across the lung, either the muscle of the patient or the mechanical ventilator. So sometimes, and this is a slide I modified from Giacomo Bellani. He left. Would have said it's mine. Sometimes dangers are hidden, and we do not see them. In this case, pressures are hidden. It's the iceberg below the water. And what is that? Is the esophageal pressure, the pressure generated by the muscles, the negative pressure, the suction generated by the inspiratory muscles around the lung, generates a transpulmonary pressure that adds up to what we read on the airways. And it might be much higher than what we read in the airways. So the first problem we have to take into account is the transpulmonary pressure during supported or assisted ventilation. And we know that for the same tidal volume, since the compliance of the lung is the same, the transpulmonary pressure will be the same, even if in blue the airway pressure is different between controlled mechanical ventilation, high pressure support, medium pressure support, low pressure support. The airway pressure goes down. But if the tidal volume is the same, the transpulmonary pressure is again the same. So the risk of ventilator-induced lung injury for the same tidal volume is identical. Next, we should take into account and always remember that a negative intrathoracic pressure increases the left heart work because the afterload of the left ventricle is increased by the negative intrathoracic pressure. And the opposite is decreased by positive intrathoracic pressure. In these days of pressure up, pressure down, we all know that. CPAP is used to get over acute pulmonary edema. And a negative pressure can decompensate the left heart, getting a patient that had normal wedge pressure and a very stable esophageal pressure into a patient in which we have huge esophageal pressure swings, negative intrathoracic pressure, and look at the wedge pressure where it goes in spite of the negative intrathoracic pressure. This patient went into pulmonary edema and had to be put back into controlled mechanical ventilation. Old stuff, but physiology is true, and swan guns are not used very often these days, but the mechanism is there. An unwinnable patient might be a decompensating patient. Third point, we have to keep in mind and to monitor, because it's underwater, we do not see it, because the alveolar pressure is an important parameter. The pressure inside the alveoli is impossible to see. It will never be displayed, because it is impossible to measure it, but we can compute it. And alveolar pressure is always lower than the airway pressure during inspiration, because air has to move from the tube to the alveoli. and it will move across a pressure gradient. Now, we have to notice that the alveolar pressure is always higher than PEEP during controlled mechanical ventilation, as here. Here you see the computed alveolar pressure is always higher than PEEP, both during inspiration and during expiration. If we put the patient on pressure support, rather high level, we see that the alveolar pressure goes down at the early inspiration and is very much lower than PEEP when pressure support is low. The higher the inspiratory flow, the bigger the difference between the airway pressure and the alveolar pressure. And alveolar pressure is a very important determinant of the interstitial pressure. If your patient has ARDS, he has leaky capillaries. And if we make a negative pressure around the leaky capillaries, the edema formation will be fostered. So keep this in mind. In controlled breathing, the alveolar pressure is always higher than the PEEP you have set in the ventilator. During pressure support, that is not warranted. It might be much lower than the PEEP you have set. During CPAP, it sure will be lower than PEEP during inspiration. I hinted in my initial slides that the respiratory drive and the respiratory pattern is very high in ARDS patients, particularly during the initial phase of ARDS. Here, we have the work of the diaphragm. And we know that controlled mechanical ventilation is very bad because it generates atrophy of the diaphragm. In hours, not even days, in hours we get atrophy of the diaphragm muscle fibers. But we should also keep in mind that, as an example, in a septic patient, the diaphragm is the membranes of the muscle fibers of the diaphragm are more fragile. And so a heavy work on a diaphragm of a septic patient might generate diaphragm dysfunction. So I've been telling you about three pressures. I've been telling you about the diaphragm. The diaphragm must be kept on exercise, but besides the atrophy of the diaphragm, we have also the problem of overworking the diaphragm. We might have damage caused by excessive load, particularly if the patient is sick, and our patients are sick. So how can we handle all these problems? Well, the clinical examination is the golden starting point. You should not forget clinical examination. I will not spend time on that. The gold standard at the opposite is the esophageal pressure. Giacomo already told you about that. Once again, during spontaneous breathing, the esophageal pressure in red in inspiration goes down, the volume goes up. Airway pressure, if you do not have the ventilator at play, stays constant. During controlled mechanical ventilation, when the volume goes up, the esophageal pressure goes up too, because during controlled ventilation, the intrathoracic pressure goes up parallel to the volume change. The higher the support, the less effort is required by the patient. Here you see CPAP, and you see the esophageal pressure that goes down a lot during inspiration. The same patient, under a certain level of pressure support, shows a much, much smaller decrease in esophageal pressure. So if we measure the esophageal pressure swing, we measure the effort of the patient. And this is a measurement taken and published by our chairman, showing that even in severe ARDS patients, even when supported by ECMO, we can have huge pressure swings. Push the wrong button. You see here, this patient, even in ECMO, even with normal blood gases, has a very high respiratory drive, making plus minus with a swing of 30 centimeters of water. His muscles are making 30 centimeters of water pressure swing. And if we add pressure support on top of it, we easily reach 45 centimeters of transpulmonary pressure. And ventilator-induced lung injury is there, even in pressure support. But the esophageal pressure is not available to everybody, but everybody can use airway-based pressure airway pressure-based measurements. The simplest is PO1, the drop in pressure during the first 100 milliseconds of an occluded inspiration. I will not explain how to do it, because how to do it, you have to push a button on the ventilator. It says PO1, you push it, and you see the number. It's not very difficult. And it changes from breath to breath. That is not because it does not work, it's because breaths are different one from the other. If you get -8, it's very bad. If you get -1, it's good. -2, -3 will not last long. Now, this is another slide we made together with Giacomo Bellani. And here you have a patient on controlled mechanical ventilation and pressure support. Can you tell me the inspiratory transpulmonary pressure of this patient? Please notice that the change in volume is the same. And we can measure it. We can measure it by doing an end inspiratory occlusion. This is difficult. You have to push a button saying end inspiratory occlusion and look at the screen. So you push the button and you see that the pressure goes up. And when the pressure is stable, you can deduct that the elastic relaxation pressure is that value. You can read the driving pressure total, machine plus patient, from the plateau. Sometimes you don't recognize the plateau because the drive is so high that you cannot reach equilibrium. So you can measure the transpulmonary pressure simply by pushing a button of the inspiratory occlusion. Please do it. 80% of the times, the patient will reach equilibrium and tell you the transpulmonary pressure. All these measurements you should do to avoid patient self-inflicted lung injury, which sure adds more and more to the initial pulmonary edema. The initial pulmonary edema that starts the ARDS increases the respiratory drive. The respiratory drive increases the edema, more drive, more edema. To stop it, one possibility is to put the patient under controlled mechanical ventilation and suppress the respiratory drive. Thank you.
Thank you.